Hello, listeners. Been wondering how you can help the show? Probably not. But here are 5 things you can do. 1. Subscribe. Support the show by clicking the subscription link in the show notes. 2. Review on iTunes, on our website, www.afraidofnothingpodcast.com, or on whatever app you listen to. 3. Donate. When you go to our website, click the cute coffee cup icon. Or in the show notes, click the subscription link. 4. Share. Sharing really is caring. Tell your friends and even your enemies to check out the show. 5. Watch. Wait a minute, it's a podcast, not a movie. Actually, it's both. Check the show notes to find out where to watch the documentary. You can also rent it on Prime Video. That's it. Oh, one last thing. Enjoy this episode.
The line between the psychopath and you is a lot thinner than you could ever imagine. And you're going to find that as you're reading this book, the book is going to read you. I tell it in a way where it's not just David's story, but it's our story. Back in the 1700s, when they would execute a man publicly in London, they would bring him through the town, and the town people would heckle. They would call him all kinds of names. And John Bradford was at the site of one of those public executions, and he stood up tall and he pointed at the criminal that everyone was calling a scoundrel and every other name you could think of. He pointed at that man and he said, "There, but for the grace of God, so go I." And what he meant by that was, that man is me. The potential is in me. I may not have committed the deed of murder, but the seed of murder, the seed of malice. I'm reading right now, read it in the past, Crime and Punishment, classic from the 1800s. And it just goes to show you what we can evolve into given the wrong set of choices and circumstances.
In a world where nothing is known, nothing is certain, reality is not real. Wake up! Be afraid of nothing. I'm Bob Heskey. Robert.
The host with the ghost.
This is my podcast, based on my paranormal documentary, Afraid of Nothing. Each episode, we talk to people who see life and the afterlife through a different lens. Join me.
Who is this large man? And what's he doing in our bedroom?
As we lift the veil and open our minds to see beyond our eyes lie. This is Afraid of Nothing.
Have you ever wondered what it's like to talk to a serial killer? What would you ask? And what would you learn? Tonight's guest, Dr. Michael Caparrelli, conducted the longest case study ever on David Berkowitz, formerly known as the Son of Sam. Doctor, welcome to the show today.
Thank you, Bob. It's a privilege to be with you.
Yeah, you've written a great new book called Monster Mirror. David Berkowitz, in his letters to the police, referred to himself as a monster, but when you interviewed him, you found something quite different, and you, over the course of 34 interview sessions and about 100 hours, you share that in this book, which we're about to unfold tonight. But what I'd like to do first is unfold your personal story. Could you please spend just a few minutes about how you evolved to become a doctor and to be sitting across from David Berkowitz in a room to write this book?
Well, it actually began for me as a pastor. I was pastoring a church in the inner city, Providence, Rhode Island, about 2 hours and 20 minutes from New York City, about an hour from Boston. And that particular church, I'd shepherded people that were from all different backgrounds of addiction, mental health problems, a lot of inmates, releasees from the prison. I started a prison chaplaincy, worked within 3 prison systems, just to develop the compassion for those locked away in institutions, and found myself in a, call it a sweet spot, just a zone where I felt very effective. Back in 2021, after finishing my PhD in behavioral science, I resigned from pastoring. I'd suffered 2 heart attacks, the second heart attack being the widowmaker, and just found the pastoring work after 16 years to be too stressful, and went in the direction of teaching. I'm a college professor at 3 different schools, adjunct professor in psychology, abnormal psychology, criminal psychology, and had also written a few books on mental health, but from a Christian perspective. Being a pastor for 16 years, I'm a student of the Bible, so I not only believe in the psychological realm, but also the supernatural. Mailed one of these books in 2021 to David Berkowitz, inmate number 78A, 1976 at Shoregun Correctional Facility in Wallkill, New York. And David read the book in a very short time because he wrote me back about maybe 2 weeks later, and he referenced the book in the letter, and he requested me to visit. Basically told me I was the guy he was looking for, given the fact that I had an understanding of the supernatural, but also I had higher education in behavioral science. I could explain the psychological, and he really wanted someone to tell his story. What were the mental health factors behind his crimes, and also to elaborate on his transformation over the last 35 years in being in prison. He's been in prison 46 years, but in 1988, he experienced a dramatic conversion, a game changer, and he's walked in that transformation over the last 35 years. So it was that grooming, if you want to call it that, between the ministry as well as the higher education and behavioral science that set the stage for me to meet David Berkowitz and begin our journey together.
Well, it's a great setup. Another setup to set the table for some of our younger listeners. Bring us back briefly to 1976, and particularly the summer of 1977. The Summer of Sam is that Spike Lee movie that came out, where the Son of Sam killing spree terrorized some boroughs of New York City. That was during a time of great unrest. There was a blackout during that time, and there was looting. There was a lot of stuff going on then. But if you could just talk a little bit about who he was back then, just so our listeners could get a better understanding.
Yeah, he was about 23 years old, just left the military, spent 3 years in the Army during the Vietnam War. And when he came home from the military, he was quite disillusioned. Now, his problems did not begin when he came home from the military. They really began around 5 or 6 years old. And that's what the book details, is that evolution from a baby into a serial killer. But when he comes out of the Army at 22, 23 years old, we're talking mid-70s, I want to say it was 1975, he feels disillusioned. His friends have scattered in a bunch of different directions. He grew up in the Bronx. Most of his friends had married, settled down, had families. Feeling very isolated and alone. A lot of psychological problems, which are also described in the book. And by the time 1976 rolls around, David begins one of New York City's most notorious bloodbaths. He gunned down 13 people. He would typically approach a car parked in a lover's lane. It wasn't always this scenario, but a good portion of the shootings happened this way. He would approach an automobile, 2 people making out, boyfriend, girlfriend, late night, usually weekends, and he would unload his .44 caliber Bulldog revolver into the craniums of the people inside that car. And this happened for a period of about a year and a half. At the same time, he was lighting fires, lit about 1,400 fires all throughout the Bronx. We know there were about 1,400 because he had left a journal when the police arrested him outside of his apartment in Yonkers, and they searched his apartment. They found a log of all the fires, the locations, the times, the places. So David was an inferno of rage. But when it was all said and done, he gunned down 13, he lit 1,400 fires, and he'd held the entire New York City hostage to fear. I mean, New York was experiencing a collective nervous breakdown. I mean, if you could think about 9/11 and the panic level following the Twin Towers being attacked, that's the only real comparison to what 1976, 1977 New York City was like. And as you said, there was a blackout. The electricity went out for about 24 hours. During the same time, he's committing these shootings. He would also leave at the crime scenes, usually somewhere in the vicinity of the corpses. He would leave a letter taunting the police, taunting the media, kind of a catch me if you can letter, often signed by the doodled monikers, either Son of Sam, the Chubby Behemoth, Monster. It wasn't until August 1977, after he killed his final victim, the young, beautiful Stacy Moskowitz, probably about a day or two later, he was arrested by the NYPD outside of his apartment, just on his way to commit what he says was potentially a mass shootout. The police had surrounded his car. The revolver was found right beside him in the car, inside of a paper bag. Also, there were maps, and there were other weapons in the back seat. And at that point, David said he was at a place in his mind where he was ready to shoot as many people as he possibly could and die suicide by cop. That probably would have been the first, one of the earliest mass shootings in crime history in America if it had not been intercepted by the NYPD.
And the NYPD caught him because of a parking ticket, right? Was the parking ticket based on his last murder or the one before that where they, he parked and he went to shoot someone and then there was a parking ticket?
Yeah, it was July 31st, 1977, somewhere around 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning. And David was, as he had many nights, prowling the streets looking for a victim. And he had found Stacy Moskowitz along with her boyfriend in Bath, Brooklyn. Right before he got out of the car and sort of stalked them for a bit and eventually killed Stacy and badly injured her boyfriend. Right before that happened, he had parked right beside a fire hydrant, came back to the car after the shooting, noticed the parking ticket on his window, and that parking ticket led to his undoing. How? Well, the police, when they were looking for witnesses, maybe somebody in the area that saw what happened the next day, they came up with the idea to look at all the parking tickets, see if there was anyone maybe in the area that saw something or identified someone. And examining, I don't know how many parking tickets, 20, 30 parking tickets, examining the parking tickets, they come across a David Berkowitz, a resident of Yonkers in Brooklyn at midnight. It just didn't add up in their mind. What is a resident in Yonkers doing in Brooklyn? So that parking ticket was the impetus for his arrest. David believes that on some subconscious level, he may have parked in front of that fire hydrant wanting to get caught. He was tormented greatly. He said to me, Mike, it was not a season of me being glee or feeling pleasure. He said it was constant torment. I was under a great deal of pressure, what he considers demonic urges. And I discussed the demonic and its interplay with the psychological in the book. But he believes that the ticket in parking in front of that fire hydrant was deliberate because he felt a great sense of relief when he was finally arrested and hauled off to prison.
Now, before we go into the book and your interviews with him, Son of Sam, can you explain the tie into that and the barking dog outside his window that he was angry at and then he felt was his master telling him to do these killings?
So he lived at 45 Pine Street in Yonkers. He's originally from the Bronx, but he eventually moved to Yonkers. He met a group of people that were involved in a cult in that neighborhood. In fact, that they had met at a park not far from his apartment in Yonkers called Untermeyer Park. He was part of that motley crew of, we'll call them young scoundrels. And he was sort of part of that whole environment. Well, next door to that apartment, 45 Pine Street, there was an older man by the name of Sam Carr, and Sam had a dog that would bark incessantly all through the night. And David believed that barking, actually not through the night, more through the daytime, because David would sleep during the day. He would work late hours at the post office. But he believed the barking dog was actually conveying a message from hell, giving him orders to kill. So Sam, son of Sam, the name Sam actually has a dual meaning. First, it references the false god or the demon, Sam Hain, that the cult worshipped and that David worshipped. But then the neighbor's name being Sam sort of played on David's psyche. He began to perceive his neighbor, Sam, as actually a messenger or some kind of avatar of Satan. And therefore, he called himself the son of Sam in the letters.
Great explanation. Yeah, that was really a crazy time. Plus the Yankees, Reggie Jackson, World Series going on or was going to happen later on that year. So a lot happening in New York at that time. When you went to meet David Berkowitz for the first time, the first in-person meeting, what surprised you?
Well, you got to keep in mind, I already had a great deal of experience in working within the prisons. Also, my dad, when I was a boy, was away in prison. In Italian-American families, the euphemism is school. My mother said, your dad's away in school. and we would visit him. I was about 11, 12 years old. I said, what's he in school for? She said, law. So I had already been acclimated to the prison environment, the protocols of, stepping into the prison. Remember our first visit, April 1st, 2022, my first visit with David. When I arrived, the correctional officer asked me my name, asked me to show him ID, all the regular protocols of stepping into a prison. And then he said, who you here to see? And I said, 78A, 1976. And he said, Berkowitz? I said, yeah. He said, well, that's a surprise. He said, he doesn't see anybody. I'm surprised that you're here to see him. He knows you're coming to see him. I said, yes. And he was a little bit taken back by that. When I met David, I'm figuring he's, 70 years old at the time. Maybe he'll be frail, arthritic. He's been in prison for a long time. Very spry. He came in, a lot of energy, very buoyant personality. Sat down, kind of a childlike personality, humble, very observant, attentive to everything. I mean, his eyes kind of scan back and forth, pays attention to what's going on in his environment. I would imagine 46 years of being incarcerated, being an Attica at one point, then Sullivan, and now Shorgunk. He's been trained to be real attentive to his environment and make sure that he's not in the way of danger. I found when he told his story, at least going back to the 70s, when he was committing the crimes, I was expecting to really hear the story of a monster, but instead I looked into a mirror, and that's the reason for the title, Monster Mirror. I found that the themes that went along his journey were themes that were not exclusive to what we call the psychopath, but were themes that affect the general population. When you spend 100 hours and you collect all your data, at the end of it all, you do what's known as thematic analysis, where you look for themes that keep surfacing. And those themes were isolation, shame, abandonment, trauma, defense mechanisms, resentment. These were the themes that affect most people. So I was expecting to, hear the story of this monster from the abyss, but instead it was the boy next door. And that's really the presupposition of this book, is that, we think psychopaths are other people. And I'm challenging the reader that there are no other people, that this quote unquote monster is more like a mirror. And I'm of the belief that if you, for 6 months, mull over every resentment you have towards perpetrators, people that hurt you, that abuse you, if for 6 months, all you do is berate yourself, you isolate, you pull back from relationships, you justify in your mind every little wrong thing you do, you might be shocked at what you evolve into. So the potentiality for psychopathy, I believe, is within everyone. And I think that America has come under a great delusion that we are good, wonderful people. But history would tell us otherwise. More than likely, you would not be on the right side of history if you were living in 1940 Germany.
Yeah.
More than likely, you would be looking back retrospectively ashamed at some of the things you did or didn't do. So the book is a real challenge for the reader because we like our monsters. We want our monsters to be other people. But I'm presenting the notion that maybe there are no other people.
So the monster in him, in David Berkowitz, was it from his genes? Was it in his DNA? Was it from his upbringing? Was it part demonic possession or satanic cult involvement? Or was it all of the above that caused the monster to come out?
You know, if you ever play the game Jenga and the tower collapses, only an ignoramus would presume that the last block is the cause of the tower's collapse. Everyone knows it's the buildup of blocks. The last block is just the final impetus, but it's really a buildup. So when we're explaining human behavior, we got to be careful for a very easy, common trap known as causal reductionism, where we take a complicated phenomenon and we try to sum it up to one thing. And we say, well, it's the genetics, or well, it's trauma. The reality is it's a buildup of blocks, and I discuss each of those blocks in the book. Do I believe that there's a genetic component? Well, yeah. I mean, the science is showing more and more those that have a psychopathic nature, there are some genetic variants associated with that, but the gene alone is not enough. I mean, there are probably many psychopaths that are walking our society that are moral, that are ethical, that are upright citizens, that are not committing these atrocities, these tragedies that David Berkowitz committed. So it's not just the genetic variant. There are also traumas that happened to David at a young age. I detail some of those traumas in the book. And then you have, I think most importantly, you have decision. You know, we don't make decisions as much as decisions make us. David came to many intersections in his life, and we talk about those crossroads. And quite often he took the wrong turn. And when he took that wrong turn, he evolved into someone. And I would challenge most listeners that as you're making decisions are making you, and you're evolving into someone that's either, let's call it a heavenly creature or a hellish creature. You lie once, you lie twice, eventually you become a liar. It becomes what's initially intentional becomes instinctual, becomes a part of who you are. So between the genetic variants, the traumatic experiences, and the decisions, and a series of each of those factors, we have the Son of Sam.
So there was a kind of almost voyeuristic part of him with the fires. He'd watch. He'd set a fire, then stand back and watch. And then the victims, which you'd probably say were, he was in his 20s, younger people at Lover's Lane. He would shoot them. I think he tried to knife the first person and it didn't go too well. And so then he would shoot them from a distance.
Correct.
Did you ever talk about why he would watch this from not intimate up close, but more from a distance? Or do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the answer to that is pretty deep. David Berkowitz was adopted at 4 days old. Now, adoption is a wonderful thing. I thank God for all the people that are across our country that are taking in, orphans and raising them as their own children. But adoption, to be removed from your biological parents, even if it's 4 days old, is what we call a primal wound. It's a wound that your mind may not remember, but your central nervous system, it never forgets. Because, the baby, the fetus, bonds with the mother for 9 months while in the mother's womb. Learning does not begin in the classroom. It begins in the womb. Studies have shown that when a baby's born, it can distinguish the smell of its mother from strangers. It can distinguish the sound of the mother's voice. So there's a bond that's formed for the first 9 months. When that bond is severed, we know from studies on kids that are adopted. Now, most adoptees are not going to become serial killers, but a large percentage speak of attachment disorders. They speak about feeling like they're on the outside looking in, being with people but never bonding with people. A big difference between being with people and bonding with people. David Berkowitz struggled with bonding from a very young age. He always felt like the outsider. Now, interestingly enough, serial killers are 16 times more likely to have been adopted than the general population.
Wow. Oh, jeez.
That's a staggering statistic. Is that saying that all adoptees are becoming serial killers? No. It does set in motion a certain attachment style meaning a way in which we relate to other people. And for David Berkowitz, his attachment style was very dysregulated and very dysfunctional from a young age. His adopted parents, Nat and Pearl Berkowitz, very loving people. They were good parents, good adopted parents. But from a young age, he pushed them away. And their love, it never stuck. It was trying to stick tape to a wet surface. And David talks about that. He talks about how his parents spared no effort in trying to reach him, but he would continually push them away and always felt like the outsider, sort of on the fringes. I mean, if you read one of the letters, for instance, when he committed the crimes, he says in no uncertain terms, I feel like an outsider. He says, I feel like I'm watching the world go by. I feel like I'm a monster, something that's this sense of belonging, wanting to belong, but not knowing how. Really, it plagued him from early childhood, and it certainly played out in the pathology of his crimes.
So this was really maybe subliminally a way to get the world to notice him and to recognize him?
You know, I would say that if you look at all the mass shooters and even serial killers, I kind of put David Berkowitz in the mass shooting category more than the serial killing category. He fits that profile more. But the mass shooters, they all have this, will somebody notice me, sort of mindset behind the killings. I mean, how many of them in recent days with the advent of the internet go online, post stuff on social media, create websites, or leave journals, create videos with video cameras, trying to send a message to the world, to family, to friends, to whoever. Now, let me just make this clear. Am I justifying at all what he did? No, we're not giving excuses. We're giving explanations. An excuse would pardon him from his consequence. There are no excuses. David Berkowitz knows there are no excuses. He accepts his punishment. He's not looking to get out. But that we do have to shed some light, come up with some explanation for further prevention.
Yeah, he accepted his guilt right away. When the police caught him, he said, you got me. And then when he got into, against his lawyer's advice, he just said, I'm guilty. And so he accepted, once he was caught, he accepted his punishment.
Correct.
I would imagine the series of interviews you probably did separately from how you organized the book, but how did you walk through the interview process, and then how did you decide to organize the book to unfold his story, to tell his transformation from a monster to a born-again Christian, a God-fearing person with feelings and compassion that he didn't have before?
They were semi-structured interviews. When you conduct qualitative research, you either have your structured interviews, which are very by the book. You have a list of questions, and you ask the questions, and the subject answers the questions. Then you have your open interviews where there's no questions. You just kind of show up with a particular gist or theme in mind and see where it unfolds. But the semi-structured is right in the middle. I would email David some questions that I wanted to discuss in our next session so he could think about them. And then when we would meet, typically those questions would follow a narrative, sort of a timeline, going back from his birth all the way into his 20s, when he was on the streets, years in prison, kind of took that chronological timeline approach. And then after collecting the data, well, I shouldn't say after, because it was really happening during the data collection as well. But after, it was certainly more laborious. And that's the thematic analysis where you're looking for those particular themes to surface. And in this case, it was nine themes that was really what I call a recipe for violence. These were the ingredients that made up the Son of Sam massacre.
And do you think your interviews with him helped him formulate in his mind who he is now, or did you think he already knew and just wanted to get that story across to you?
Well, by the end of the book, and I'll let the reader see this for themselves, I won't give away the punchline, David Berkowitz did make a shocking confession. He had something he needed to get off his chest. It was very therapeutic for him. I do believe in his conversion. I don't believe he's a perfect man. Who is? Nobody is. I do believe that he loves his Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. I believe he's a sincere Christian with many blemishes and defects, just as I am. But he had some unfinished business, and he had some things he needed to talk about, which he did by the end of the book. And for him, that was freedom. I call it hugging the cactus. It's not my phrase. It's a phrase used in recovery.
That's great, yeah.
When you come clean, you come clean about some stuff that's very difficult to admit. And he hugs the cactus at the end of the book, and he admits some things that he couldn't admit to anyone else. And it was very freeing for him. So I think there are many benefits that David reaped from our time together. And we continue the relationship. I still meet with him about once a month.
How is he perceived in the prison population? I mean, I would imagine at first people just want to tear his head off. I mean, how is he perceived? Is he kind of a mentor to others, or does he just keep to himself?
It's funny, when he walks into the visiting room, there's some inmates within the vicinity, and he stops and they call him Pastor Dave. He blushes when they call him Pastor Dave. It's not a title he's comfortable with, but he's sort of taken this role of mentor to quite a few of the guys. He meets with a group of guys, probably about 15 to 17 in number a week on Tuesday nights. He sets the chairs up in a circle, and they'll open the Bible. They'll read a passage of scripture, but more importantly, the passage of scripture will read them, and they'll open up about struggles on the home front, struggles within the institution, stuff that they're afraid of, and David helps to walk them through. Not only is he mentoring the 15 to 17 guys in the prison, but he receives hundreds of letters from people around the world. I think they see David as someone they can write to and feel safe. He's not going to have any stones to throw. He'd be the last person to judge anyone because of his background. So you got suicidal teenagers that are writing him, and David's talking them off of ledges. In fact, the guy who killed on the college campus in Utah 2 years ago, he killed 4 students, the campus killer. He wrote David twice. Wrote once when he was out and about, and then once, I believe, at some point afterwards. I don't know the details. David didn't tell me too much about that. But I have seen many of the letters. I've seen how effective he is in ministering to people. People do, believe it or not, as hard as this may be for some people to believe this, but people do look up to him.
Yeah, that's almost like another book, Letters to Son of Sam.
Yeah.
You're going to cover a lot of stuff in your book, obviously, but a lot of people, as you said, are troubled out there and struggle with their faith. How did you come to accept Jesus Christ as your Savior, and how did he? Were there similarities? What was the telling moment when that happened?
Yeah, so for me, I was I was locked up at 17 years old. I grew up in a home where crime was normal, and when I was 17, I had robbed a police car. Believe it or not.
Wow!
I was with two friends. It was an unmarked car. We didn't know it until we broke in, but knowing whose car it was after we broke in, seeing the police equipment didn't stop us. We kept going. And when I was locked up at juvenile jail at 17, there was a correctional officer who was also a prison chaplain. He would show up with his guitar and his Bible, and he would sing Christian songs and read the Bible. And something touched my heart while I was locked up. And when I got out of juvenile jail, I had immediately joined a church, became a Christian. My whole life changed. And similarly for David, 1988, he's walking the prison yard. He's in Sullivan County. And while he's walking the prison yard in January, it's a cold night. This young Hispanic inmate, just a couple of years younger than David, the time he's in his late 20s. David was maybe in his 30s. The guy's name was Rick. He approached David and he said, "David, Jesus loves you." And David sort of pushed him away, and he said he could never love a guy like me. And what I've done is unforgivable. And Rick persisted, and they would talk. They would walk around that prison yard and talk for an hour, hour and a half. Eventually, Rick gave David a Gideon Bible, and David went back to his cell, read the Bible, and just started crying at his bedside. And he said he was on his knees for about an hour, hour and a half, just sobbing over every wrong thing he'd done, all the atrocities he committed, all the pain he inflicted on people. And he said he woke up the next day and he felt like a new man. And he told Rick, and Rick was rejoicing. He joined the chapel community there in the prison in Sullivan. And then shortly thereafter, Rick just disappeared. He was relocated somewhere, and David said it was like an angel. I never heard from Rick again. And he's been walking with God since. He's had a lot of bumps in the road. One of the reasons why I believe David Berkowitz's transformation is I can see the blemishes. If a gemologist is studying a stone and the stone is perfect, it's not a diamond, it's a cubicirconium. You can buy it on the home shopping network. But a gemologist, when he sees the cracks, he sees the flaws. The transparency of the flaws is the evidence that this is the real thing. So David Berkowitz, is not his perfection that made me believe in his testimony. It's his imperfections. And it's his willingness to be transparent about those flaws. That to me was a real, litmus test that this was a real conversion. I had met with 2 other serial killers in my time of doing prison ministry. Both of them were playing psychopathic games. your typical jailhouse conversions, which usually don't last longer than 6 months. It's usually prior to a parole hearing. And those relationships came to an impasse. I couldn't go any further. But that's not the case with David. It's hard to fake a conversion for 35 years. And not only that, I've seen David, not just his actions, but I've seen his reactions. I've seen how he reacts when he's angry. I tell in the book, in chapter 2, about a conflict that he had with an inmate and how he managed that anger. I showed up for a session right at the end of the conflict. So I got a chance to see David Berkowitz upset and how to handle that anger. So I've seen his reactions. Reactions are a better litmus test than actions, because they're a man's actions when he's caught off guard in real time, when he's taken by surprise, when he's under pressure. And all of that said, I'm a witness that there is a real transformation that has happened.
What about those serial killers that don't change? David Berkowitz is a good story, or at least a good ending. Those ones that don't, is there any message, or are they just lost souls that aren't gonna make it once they leave this world?
Bob, here's the deal. Most people don't change. That sounds cynical, but if you really do a real analysis, maybe on your own self as a listener, you're listening right now,
Yep.
Your friends. I mean, how many times you meet somebody, you haven't seen them in 20 years, 30 years, when you were in high school together? They're telling the same stories, the same hang-ups, the same habits. Change is not easy. Isaac Newton's first law of motion, everything stays in a state of inertia until something from the outside pushes it out of that state of inertia into activity. And it usually takes crisis. It takes some circumstances that are outside our control that sort of push us into a corner. And even that, most people still are humbled, but still not humble. There's a big difference between being humbled and being humble. So yeah, you're right. A large percentage of the criminal population, I mean, the recidivism rates would scientifically prove that. A large percentage of the criminal population does not change. But there are those, like John Newton, when he wrote the song Amazing Grace, that can say, I was once lost, but now I'm found. I was once blind, but now I see. And I do believe David Berkowitz is one of those people. That's not saying I think he should get out. I think that the crimes that he's committed, the murders he's committed, and the pain that he's inflicted upon families and those relatives that are still alive, it would be a real slap in the face for them to see him released.
He probably feels the same way too, right? I mean, he did 47 years ago, or whatever it was, 46 years ago. Does he feel the same way? He's not looking to leave. He's just looking to make a difference where he is and have people have a better understanding of him?
Yeah, he goes up for parole every 2 years. Initially, he blew off the parole hearings, but then it was perceived as arrogance by the parole committee that he wouldn't show up for these parole hearings. It was like an insult. So he decided to show up, but he goes with no expectation. His main agenda when he shows up is to share his story. I've read the transcripts at those parole hearings. That's exactly what he does. He'll be going up for parole again in May, and he testifies. He testifies to the changes in his heart as a result of Jesus Christ, but he knows that, it's a slim possibility that they would ever release him because of the social, political backlash. Yeah, he has made the most of his life behind bars.
And through this 100 hours of interviews, 34 plus sessions, and still ongoing, is there one thing he said or one personal experience with him that sticks in your mind that really defines him to you?
Oh, there's a lot. I'm always, I don't want to say surprised, but I'm always moved by his empathy. Because as we know, psychopaths are always described as having low or no empathy. So to see his empathetic qualities, and some might say, well, he's faking it. I've seen him remember so many names of inmates and their stories, and then ask me to pray because of this particular need of this particular inmate or this particular hardship that the inmate's going through. I mean, his memory bank of names and people's stories and struggles and how he prays for them, his demonstration of empathy to me has been probably the thing that's moved me the most.
I think you've already touched on it, Dr. Caparrelli, but what do you think is a key takeaway, or why would readers, what would you give them in a sentence or so, why they would be interested or inspired by David Berkowitz's story?
the line between the psychopath and you is a lot thinner than you could ever imagine. And you're going to find that as you're reading this book, the book is going to read you. I tell it in a way where it's not just David's story, but it's our story. Back in the 1700s, when they would execute a man publicly in London, they would bring him through the town, and the town people would heckle. They would call him all kinds of names. And John Bradford was at the site of one of those public executions, and he stood up tall and he pointed at the criminal that everyone was calling a scoundrel and every other name you could think of. He pointed at that man and he said, "There, but for the grace of God, so go I." And what he meant by that was, that man is me. The potential is in me. I may not have committed the deed of murder, but the seed of murder, the seed of malice. I'm reading right now, read it in the past, Crime and Punishment, classic from the 1800s. And it just goes to show you what we can evolve into given the wrong set of choices and circumstances. So I think that that's probably the biggest takeaway of the book.
And your website is www.unmuted.app. A-P-P. Can you talk about Unmuted and its mission?
Well, I travel the country. I was in, 17 or 18 states in the last year. I speak in churches, prisons, schools. In addition to my teaching during the week, I usually do the traveling on the weekends. And it's under the auspices of a nonprofit named Unmuted. It's called Unmuted because it's about giving people that have been traumatized their voices back. It's about helping those that have been mentally and emotionally afflicted come out of their bondage. I conduct seminars under the auspices of that organization. I write books. I've written 5. Dr. Jesus, Pen Your Pain in the Parables, Surviving Feelings, The Ox and the Ass, and then most recently, David's book called Monster Mirror. And it's an organization that's giving victims of trauma their voices back.
And what's next? I mean, do you plan to talk to other serial killers, or is there another type of book that you have that you're going to write in 2024?
Well, right now, all the focus is on this book, Monster Mirror, 100 Hours of David Berkowitz. I've been on a collection of talk shows from the 700 Club, before 1 million people.
Wow, right.
On TV to podcasts. I mean, I'm all over the place right now, just promoting the book. The book has sold thousands since its release on October the 10th this year. It was ranked on Amazon the #1 true crime new release for the first 3 days. So that's the focus right now. I would definitely be open to doing this again with another prisoner with a similar story. The journey was just too rewarding for me to not want to do it again.
And where can people buy your book? Maybe say your website one more time, or any other place where they can purchase Monster Mirror.
You can purchase it on my website, unmuted.app, A-P-P, or the easy way, you can go on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can order the paperback, the Kindle version. You can even get it in Spanish. I won't even try to pronounce the Spanish title. But if you know Spanish, just whatever the Spanish title is for Monster Mirror, type it in the Amazon search engine. You'll see it, and you can order it in Spanish.
That's great. Dr. Caparrelli, thank you so much for your time. Very few people are like you out there that have found change, found religion, found faith, and work with others to help get their story out and give us a glimpse of light in times where it really isn't so bright right now. So I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much for having me, Bob.
You've been listening to the Afraid of Nothing podcast. Please subscribe and like us on Facebook. Until next time, stay scared.
Hey, you're still here? Great. Then why not listen to another episode? Visit afraidofnothingpodcast.com to peruse all the shows. That's afraidofnothingpodcast.com. And while you're there, click the coffee cup icon to buy me a coffee and leave a review. I'll give you a shout out in an upcoming episode, and the world will know how swell you are.